So, what is it exactly? An unremarkable entry-level mid-range zoom lens? A landscape photographer's dream? A cheap and underwhelming cousin to the 50-140? A videographer's lightweight best friend? The perfect travel zoom? A wildlife photography gateway drug? A do-it-all lens? Rhetorical questions and bullshit aside, the Fujifilm XF 55-200mm F3.5-4.8 R LM OIS has been called all these things and more by reviewers waxing poetic and slamming this lens for the YouTube ad revenue 10 minutes at a time. And today, I want to cut through some of that white noise and focus on the bigger picture that surrounds this lens through actual daily use. Why? Okay, that was the last rhetorical question. Because I have a big mouth, a few Fujifilm cameras, and something to prove about everything and absolutely nothing all at the same time. And this might actually be a useful resource for someone looking at this lens for their own collection from an actual real-life user's perspective, like I was looking for a few months ago, to no avail. So, let's shake up the talking head format a bit and spend a full day with this lens taking a look at its photo and video performance in the semi-sunny Southern California.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing makes you feel more like you've redeemed all of that wasted potential of your early 20s by waking up early at least a few times a month to do a sunrise landscape photo shoot. The first sunrise trip was a quick one, jumping over to the Santa Monica mountain range in Thousand Oaks, California. I got me and the missus up about 4 in the morning just to beat the COVID-riddled crowds and to take just 1 or 2 shots in the dark about a mile up the recreational trails. The first shot of this lens's story starts with a simple and not complex at all X-pan cropped panoramic HDR photo, panos being something this lens actually excels at, either handheld with its OIS system on or with the OIS system off on a good set of sticks like I had it mounted on this morning. I'm one of those rare masochists that loves a good manual panorama, and getting a good pano, you need to start off with a sharp lens that won't drop off quality in the corners. While it might be a scary notion trusting a mid-range zoom to do a sharp job, the 55-200mm works best zoomed anywhere between 50 to about 120mm and stopped down to about f8, at least in my testing. And I'm more than happy to report it's as sharp as a tack or my quick wit edge to edge in those conditions. This first shot was taken in the pre-morning glow all the way back at 55mm, and all I gotta say is that I think I'm starting off with one of my favorite images of this video right out the gate, and boy oh boy does this lens render the entire scene beautifully when you use it right. I even took a second shot later as the sun began to hit the mountains with my red badge Fuji 16-55mm just to see what the 55-200 would look like side by side with the top end zoom from Fuji. And I can say confidently that the much cheaper Fuji 55-200 can hold its own with the big boys, at least stop down. Both shots look just about the same side by side, but I think the 55-200 might even be a bit microscopically sharper in some of the smaller detail areas, at least in these 2 shots. Unfortunately, I didn't get much time to shoot anything else out there before the crowds and the unmasked masses started to show up in their neon spandex death packs, so it was time to beat a hasty retreat and move on to the next location. As the sun now steadily rises over Southern California, we find ourselves at the top of the Grant Park Lookout in Ventura, California, which is a favorite place for both locals and tourists alike to get their predominantly Christ-focused Instagram shots and to soak up the sweeping views of the California coastline. Okay, maybe I arrived a little past prime soft morning light, but luckily for me, I got there just in time before the sun fully illuminated the northern beachside valleys of Ventura County, so I had some time to pick out and plan a composition or 2 before freezing my behind off. The first shot of mid-morning might have been an overly ambitious task, or really, just plain stupid on my behalf of the 55-200mm. I started off by shooting on the long end of the lens into an angle just off from the direction of the harsh sunlight to capture the last little bits of low coastal morning fog which was beginning to burn off across the beaches and city below. Now, I can't say this was the best composition in the world, and that was mostly due to my poor but luxurious use of planning time, but this was a bit of a little warm-up test for the lens, so let's see the results anyway. Of course, corner-to-corner sharpness at the extremely long end is not the greatest strength of any mid-range telephoto, and unfortunately at 148mm, the image sharpness breaks apart just as quickly as my ego while secretly comparing shampoo bottle sizes with other boys in the YMCA locker room. This being said, center sharpness is still pretty excellent at this range. Zooming in to 400%, you can even pick out the individual outlines of people strolling across the beach about 2 miles away from where I was standing. But not being too happy with that center sharpness, I decided to take the same shot but backing off to about 90mm, which yielded much better results. As you can see, the image was quite sharp overall, with most of the lack of sharpness in some areas being due to the atmospheric effects more than anything. I also tried playing around with the extreme contrast on this side of the hill a bit more, setting my sights all the way down to the 2 towering Oxnard buildings about a city over. By that time, I was shooting directly into the rising sun and getting very soft but very noticeable flaring, which you can expect from any lens you're trying to play Icarus with. Yes, flaring will happen with this lens, as with any, but it's definitely well controlled with the Fuji EBC coating and falls well within my acceptable preferences when I'm not being an absolute YouTube review goon about it, and when I'm using the massive lens hood that comes on this lens. Oh, and a quick side note, there's been a lot of ribbing by reviewers about how large and bulky the 55-200's lens hood is. Now, the lens hood is not a fashion piece. It's meant to cut down on light flaring, which this one does particularly well. But being fair, I noticed that the 55-200 shares the same filter diameter and hood size as the Fujifilm 23mm, so just to show you what the lens hood looks like with one of these dearly beloved Fujifilm square lens hoods. Oh, yeah. Ooh, ooh. Yeah, much better. Sleek and sexy. Anyway, back to the image review. I got pretty damn bored of the pixel peeper test, so I headed over to the north side of the lookout, where you can get a great view of Ventura Avenue that runs straight up the northern valleys that eventually sneak into the wild hillbilly wilderness of Ojai, California. From here, I took my favorite shot of the mid-morning. Watching the rising light cut across the valley, I captured this HDR at about 60mm. Now, everything is as sharp and clear as an X-Trans photo Lightroom can get, and there's a good level of detail everywhere you look. Even at 400%, you can still pick out those individual cars in the neighborhoods below. Just keep in mind that you might have to put your work in to add color and contrast back into your images that you edit, since this lens tends to render everything a bit too flat for my liking. Now, a quick aside here, you might notice that a lot of these photos from the review are actually very color rich and saturated, and that's because I'm using a modified version of the Rockwell Velvia film simulation recipe cooked up by Richie over at Fuji X Weekly. I haven't really played around much with the Velvia profile while shooting with Fujifilm, which is kind of a shame, since I do like to experiment with new ways of processing my images, especially since I've been getting deeper into Fujifilm simulations and landscape photography this year. And I know, it's not everyone's cup of tea, and most professional landscape photographers poo-poo on oversaturation and vividness, and I did too for a long while, but I think I'm actually warming up to the look a bit now that I've actually taken the time to have some fun and to shoot in different styles. So if you want to experiment too and see if there's some new ways that you want to use Fujifilm simulations, I definitely check out FujiXweekly.com for their extensive list of Fujifilm simulation recipes for custom looks and film stock emulations for just about every X camera out there, even some Bayer filter ones. Alright, that's about all I could squeeze out of the morning, so it's time to break out this lens in high noon and do a little bit of wildlife and video testing and a lot more landscape shooting down at Seaside Wilderness Park on the far north side of Ventura City proper. The LM in the 55-200mm name stands for the linear motor in this lens that focuses quite quickly and accurately under good lighting conditions. However, it's still a lot to ask one motor to move all that glass in a zoom lens, which is why Fuji opts to put 2 of these motors in their professional 50-140 zoom. And I noticed a few times that this lens would just barely miss critical focus even when using a well-placed single-point focusing system, something that can be quite disappointing and frustrating when you lose a good shot by mere inches. Now, that being said, those times are few and far in between, and you can still rely on this lens's tracking to do fast-moving subjects about, 90 to 95% of the time. Every time. But going back to the images of the Raven for just a second, you can definitely start to see one of this lens's major weaknesses: chromatic aberration wide open. Yes, this lens will suffer from very noticeable purple and blue fringing in high contrast areas when this lens is set to its maximum aperture in the range, so much so that it would be impossible to completely correct it away without losing major edge color detail. Now, it's not the worst I've ever seen, nor does it present itself in anything other than very high contrast scenes. I mean, I only really got a good example of these 2 images of the Raven, but it's something that might drive some crazy, especially when it's multiplied by the fact that you really don't get that much of a chance to get a shallow depth of field with this variable aperture zoom, and you're already losing a fair bit of sharpness shooting at the long end of this lens anyway. But again, this is pretty nitpicky since this lens really wasn't designed to be a wide open workhorse like some of the red badge zooms or wide aperture primes, which can be almost, if not more than double the price of this lens. And stop down to past f6, I found that you can get some really great results from this lens, and I think it's the perfect travel companion to carry around on your body and grab some nice, sharp snapshots of your day-to-day goings-on and casual photo walks, as long as you don't expect it to paint your bright and blurry background magnum opus. While I did mention earlier that the optical stabilization works well for photography, the results are slightly less impressive on the video end. While I wasn't doing anything special for the video test, just grabbing quick handheld B-roll shots along the way, no matter where I was in the range or how still I was, there was always some times where I would get very obvious camera shake and panning confusion out of the OIS system. Now, this wasn't the most clinical video test, and there will be other areas of this video where you can see some more B-roll samples, but all I have to say is that I definitely try your best to keep this thing stable while I'm filming. That being said, it's not all the lens's fault. Yes, OIS is not the magic fix-all shake system. Yes, it's a telephoto lens. Yes, it was very windy that day. And yes, I was not using it carefully half the time. And finally, yes, I was not testing this with a body that has IBIS. While OIS is a must for longer lenses, you must use it carefully in order to get the best results. And I think you can get some good results if you just shoot with intent and hold the damn camera steady. But there isn't all complaints on the video side of things for me. The AF motor in this lens actually works quite well for video and continuously tracking subjects, and it can work just as quickly as it does for photos, only losing focus in the most challenging tracking or shooting situations. But speaking of AF performance, that brings us to sunset, which will be a mix of my time at Ventura Harbor and some images I got in Huntington Beach, California when I last visited. Why am I mixing 2 locations, you ask? Because I'm stretching for content, and I found another flaw with this lens that has to do with on-lens filtration. Something I always use when shooting professional video or if I'm out in rapidly changing lighting conditions is a screw-on ND and polarization filter system to keep a 180-degree shutter or correct exposure. And unfortunately, about every one of the shots that I got at Ventura Harbor were absolutely destroyed by the fact that the 55-200mm struggled so much with my combo filter from Newer, even set to a minimum 3-stop ND. Now, I could be wrong, I often am, but I personally don't believe this is completely a filter quality fault. Cheap NDs can mess up an image quality, and while these image samples were a bit smeary, I've used the Newer filter many times in both video and in landscape with sharp results. But for some reason, the 55-200mm really seemed to struggle with this filtration system. I mean, this lens is a good focuser, even in low light, which is mostly thanks to the Fujifilm AF algorithm. But with this filter, both in video and in photos, this lens would constantly miss AF completely, leading to some pretty horrific results. Even this lovely photo of the blue heron that I got at the harbor ended up just slightly back focused, even in good light, so while I will go back and test this lens again with better filters in the future, I would avoid either using a cheap filter or heavy filtration on this lens at all if you can. But I did get to test this lens on some birds over in Orange County around the same time of day with a lot better results without using filters up front minus a clear Tiffin UV one. Even in uneven and harsh lighting conditions, the AF can work a treat if you take your time and shoot your scene right. And I couldn't be happier with some of the shots that I got. For example, I was even able to track this pelican that was dipping quickly in and out of the water and bouncing across the surface of the wavy marsh. Sure, even a 300mm equivalent lens might not be the most optimal for shooting up-close wildlife photography. The 55-200 is no super zoom, but you kind of know what you're getting into since the range is printed right on the lens and on the side of the box it comes in, and 200mm is as far of a reach as you can get at the moment with native Fuji glass without stepping up to the 100-400mm red badge zoom or stepping down to the 50-230mm XC lens. But, you know, this all comes down to a compromise of quality, usability, and price that all lenses have to go to, and Fujifilm usually balances quite fairly. And I found the 82-300mm equivalent range quite useful for casual wildlife shooting, allowing me to get fairly tight into my subjects and clean up the frame without having to crop in and post all that often. Something that would be slightly harder to do with smaller subjects using something like the Fujifilm 50-140, which is a 70-200mm equivalent lens. So, as we go kicking and screaming into the good night, what are my overall thoughts about this lens? While the Fujifilm XF 55-200mm does have its trade-offs here and there, remember, it's a pretty great value for the money, costing about $500 USD brand new at the time of filming, and it's hard to get anything quite as good as this telephoto lens on just about any system, especially APS-C system specific lenses. This lens is compact and well built, 82-300mm equivalent lens with a very usable range from anything from landscape to wildlife shooting. Yes, it's variable aperture lens. It's not the best wide open, but stopping it down leads to some very sharp results. It has a quick focusing motor that only misses on rare occasions. It can focus pretty accurately with photos and videos as long as you aren't trying to heavily filter it or use in extremely dark scenarios. The OIS works well for photography, maybe not as rock solid for video, but all in all, you can keep your frame pretty damn stable compared to just trying to handhold a telephoto lens. And I think all of this makes it a pretty great package for a photography enthusiast or a professional on a budget who's looking for a solid mid-range telephoto zoom lens for general purpose isn't looking to break the bank on more expensive alternatives like the 50-140 or the 100-400 millimeter, which both cost well over $1,000 USD. And yeah, that's about it. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing for more sporadic photography related content. And if I missed something or messed something up, please let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching me ramble on, but remember, all gear review out there is biased, so don't just trust me. Do your research before jumping on the new gear bandwagon, and check out some of the other great reviews on the 55-200 millimeters that I've linked down below. This has been Ben Heitrick from BNHY. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, but don't choke your rotisserie chicken. It's already cooked.